I really want you to take a second and just imagine standing in the absolute ruin of everything you know, like the borders of your country on the map. Just gone.
Right. Completely wiped out.
Yeah, exactly. The government structures, the monuments, the street signs that are in your native language, even the libraries that hold your history, burned or just repurposed by an invading force.
It's a terrifying thought.
It really is. So if you are standing in that rubble, smelling the smoke of your own civilization, what does it actually take to keep the soul of your culture alive? How do you pack an entire worldview into like a suitcase of words and carry it forward into a future that actively wants to erase you?
Well, it is the ultimate existential crisis for a culture. I mean, we're so conditioned to think of civilizations as these permanent fixtures,
Yeah.
right? Built of concrete and steel and institutional laws.
Right, the stuff you can touch.
Exactly. But when the physical architecture is violently dismantled, you were left with this terrifying question of what a culture actually is without its geography.
And that is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. We are looking at a stack of sources centered on this staggering piece of literature that acted as a literal functioning arc for Persian identity. We are diving into the Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings.
It's such a monumental text.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this, because the sheer scale of what we're talking about is honestly hard to wrap your head around. We're looking at a text composed of over 50,000 couplets,
Yeah.
written 1,000 years ago by a poet named Ferdowsi. And, he wasn't writing this from a cozy place of comfort. He was writing it while the Persian identity was rapidly fading under Arab and later Turkic Islamic rule.
The socio-political backdrop here is just crucial to understand. This wasn't some leisurely artistic endeavor, Ferdowsi spent 30 years of his life writing this. 30 years, pouring his own dwindling wealth into it.
It was just a massive commitment.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's this quote from his writings in our sources that essentially functions as his thesis statement. He wrote, when our language and history were on the verge of disappearing, I revived Iran with this Persian language.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a massive flex, but it's also this really desperate declaration.
It's an act of absolute ink-stained rebellion. But what really fascinates me is how he did it. The sources note that Ferdowsi intentionally stripped out almost all the Arabic loanwords that had flooded into the language over the centuries following the conquest.
Right, which is no small feat.
Yeah, he was performing a linguistic excavation, forcing the poetry to run on pure ancient Persian.
And that is really the mechanical genius of the Shahnameh. By choosing the Mutakarib meter, which is a highly rhythmic, driving, poetic meter that literally sounds like a galloping horse, he wasn't just writing a book.
So he was making it catchy.
Exactly. He was creating a sonic mnemonic device. He was building an oral database. Because, even if every physical copy of the book burned, the meter was so infectious that people could memorize vast chunks of it.
And just recite it.
Right. In coffee houses as homes for generations. He essentially weaponized poetry for cultural survival.
So to figure out what he was so desperate to save, we have to look at the universe he built inside this poem. And the epic doesn't just start with a political skirmish. It goes all the way back to the dawn of humanity.
All the way back.
Yeah, the very first king introduced is Kimars, who essentially creates the concept of the world as a civilized place.
Right. And the progression from Kimars onward is highly systematic. The epic traces how humanity evolved from living in caves and wearing animal skins to establishing a functioning society.
So it's not just kings ruling, it's kings teaching.
Exactly. These early kings are less like politicians and more like Promethean figures. They teach humanity the absolute basics. How to harness fire, how to domesticate animals, how to smelt metal for tools, how to weave clothes.
It's the origin story of human comfort. They're dragging humanity out of the mud and giving them dignity. And this upward trajectory, this building of civilization, hits its absolute peak with a king named Jamshid.
Ah, Jamshid.
Right. The sources focus heavily on Jamshid because his reign is described as this 300-year golden age. 300 years. During this period, the epic tells us, the world was completely free of disease, aging, and death. It's an absolute utopia.
It really is the ultimate human fantasy realized.
Yeah.
But we have to look at the psychological implications of that. 3 centuries of continuous peace, no mortality, no sickness.
That sounds exhausting, honestly.
Well, Jamshid isn't just a king at this point. He is managing a flawless, static paradise. And that is exactly where the structural integrity of the myth begins to crack.
Well, yeah, because how do you stay grounded when no one in your kingdom has coughed or died for 300 years?
Exactly.
The sources say Jamshid looks at all of this, the medicine, the architecture, the perfect society, and he makes a fatal error. He buys into his own hype.
He really
He
did.
proclaims himself a god, and the second he does that, this mystical concept called the far abandons him. It just flies away.
The concept of the far is arguably the most important political and spiritual mechanism in the entire Shahnameh. It translates roughly to a divine, luminous, royal glory. But it's not just an aura, it's a moral mandate.
It's almost like a public mandate, right? Or like a superhero losing their powers the second they get an ego. But wait, I want to push back on the text here for a second,
Yeah, that's
because
fine.
I find myself sympathizing with Jamshid a little bit. If you literally organize humanity, teach them how to mine iron, cure every disease, and put an end to death for 3 centuries, isn't it entirely logical that you would start to think you've transcended humanity? Was the far demanding some impossible standard of perfection from a guy who basically solved existence?
That's a very modern, pragmatic way to look at it. But if we connect this to the broader cosmologies of the epic, the far isn't a reward for a high approval rating, you know? It's not about hitting your administrative KPIs.
Okay, so what is it then?
It is a strict conditional contract between the ruler and the cosmic order. The far dictates that you are a steward of the creator, not the creator yourself.
Ah, so it's about knowing your place in the hierarchy.
Exactly. The moment Jamshid claims divinity, he severs that tether. He commits the ultimate sin of hubris. The far demands that a ruler recognize that their power is borrowed, meant only to serve justice and the people.
Right.
When Jamshid makes it about his own ego, the mandate to rule vanishes instantly. And the crucial takeaway here is that when the far leaves a king, it doesn't just result in a change of government, it leaves a catastrophic vacuum in the spiritual and physical reality of the world.
And as we know, a vacuum practically begs to be filled. The epic immediately proves that a failure of leadership at the top doesn't just mean your taxes go up. It invites literal, unspeakable horror into the world. Which brings us to the entity that steps into that vacuum, Zahhak.
Oh, Zahhak.
Oh.
The transition from the Golden Age to the reign of Zahhak is one of the most jarring tonal shifts in world literature.
It's wild.
Yeah, Zahhak is an Arab prince who is seduced by demons. He murders his own father to take power, and then he capitalizes on the chaos in Persia. The chaos caused by Jamshid losing the far to usurp the Persian throne.
And it's not just a political takeover, it is a physical manifestation of evil. The visual the sources describe is pure body horror.
Pure horror.
Zahhak makes a pact with the devil figure, Ahriman, who kisses Zahhak on both shoulders. And from those kisses, 2 terrifying black snakes grow directly out of Zahhak's flesh.
Literally out of his shoulders.
Yeah, and the mechanics of this curse are what really stick with you. If you cut the snakes off, they just grow right back.
They are indestructible parasites.
Yeah.
But the true horror is their diet. The demonic snakes require constant feeding to keep from eating Zahhak's own brain. And their only acceptable food is the brains of 2 human youths every single day.
Every day. 2 young people dragged from their homes, executed, their brains fed to the shoulders of the king. You know, when you look at that metaphorically, it is a chillingly accurate description of how tyrannical regimes operate.
It really is.
It's literal brain drain. You have a corrupted, parasitic leadership that can only sustain itself by violently consuming the potential, the innovation, and the future of its own society.
It is a profound metaphor for generational destruction. And the sources emphasize a critical detail here. Zahhak's reign isn't a short, violent blip. This nightmare lasts for 1,000 years.
A millennium. Imagine you are a citizen in year 600 of Zahhak's reign. The golden age of Jamshid is so far gone it sounds like a fairy tale.
Right, it's just a myth to them.
Exactly. All you know, all your parents knew, all your great-great-grandparents knew is the daily knock on the door and the sacrifice of the youth. How does a culture even maintain its sanity under that kind of prolonged, normalized horror?
Well, it creates a deep psychological scarring. The epic is telling us that darkness isn't just an event. It can become the atmospheric condition of an entire era.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, when evil is institutionalized for 1,000 years, it fundamentally rewrites the nervous system of a civilization. Yeah. People stop believing that the light ever existed.
But eventually, even a 1,000-year machine breaks down. You can only consume the future for so long before the people who are actually holding the civilization together decide they've had enough.
They hit a breaking point.
Yeah. The elites have failed, the divine kings have failed. So the rebellion has to come from the dirt. It comes from the working class.
And this is where Ferdowsi makes a brilliant socio-political statement.
Hmm.
The catalyst for the rebellion against Zahhak doesn't come from a hidden royal heir or a magical artifact. It comes from a man named Kaveh, a humble blacksmith.
Kaveh is the grieving father. He has already lost several sons to the snakes, and when the guards come for his last remaining son, something in him just snaps.
Right.
He marches into Zahhak's court, demands justice, and sparks an uprising. But the detail I love the most in this entire epic is what he uses for a flag.
Oh, the flag is amazing.
Right. He doesn't go find a golden crest. He takes off his heavy, burn-marked leather blacksmith's apron, and he ties it to the end of a spear.
The Darash Kaviani. It becomes the most sacred banner in Persian mythology.
Yes, a dirty piece of leather. What does that say about who really holds the power in these myths? Ferdowsi, who is the actual legitimate royal heir to the throne, has been hiding in the mountains.
Right, waiting for his moment.
But Ferdowsi can't do anything on his own. He literally has to rally his armies under Kaveh's sweaty work apron.
It is a profound inversion of the divine right of kings. The text is making it explicitly clear that divine grace is utterly meaningless without the consent and the resilience of the common people.
Wow, yeah.
Jamshid had all the divine grace in the world and his arrogance ruined it.
Mm.
Kaveh has no magic, no divine right, just a leather apron and the agonizing grief of a father. Yet that leather apron is what actually overthrows the demon king.
That's incredible.
It tells the listener that the true scion of a civilization is not the crown, but the collective breaking point of the working class.
So Ferdowsi and Kaveh lead this massive populist charge. They storm the capital, they defeat Zahhak. But the climax here has a very specific weird twist.
It does.
They don't cut Zahhak's head off. The sources note that an angel intervenes and tells Ferdowsi not to kill him. Instead, they drag Zahhak to Mount Damavand, which is a massive, real-world volcano in northern Iran, and they chain him deep inside the mountain for eternity.
Yes, and that is not just a dramatic set piece. It is a highly calculated philosophical point.
But why? Why leave the guy with the brain-eating snakes alive? Just end it.
Because Ferdowsi understood the nature of tyranny. By chaining Zahhak instead of executing him, the epic proposes that evil, absolute corruption, and the parasitic nature of power cannot be permanently assassinated.
Yeah.
You cannot kill an ideology with a sword.
Right, you can't just stab a bad idea.
Exactly. It is an ever-present force in human nature.
Ah, so he's a latent threat.
Precisely. Chaining him in Mount Damavand turns a geographical landmark into a permanent psychological warning system. Every time a Persian looks at that volcano, they are reminded that tyranny is simply dormant.
That is heavy.
If the people grow complacent, if they forget the sacrifices of Kaveh the blacksmith, the chains will rust and the darkness will break loose again. It is a mandate for eternal vigilance.
That is so incredibly layered. And with the sealing of Zahhak, the epic shifts its tone completely. The pure mythical age of these godlike kings and thousand-year reigns starts to recede. We move into what the sources call the heroic age.
Right, the world changes.
The world is settling down, becoming a bit more human, which means the protectors of this world need to change too.
Yes, the elemental kings step back, and the burden of defending this newly freed civilization falls onto the shoulders of a legendary family of champions. But what is so fascinating about the heroic age is how deeply flawed and grounded it is compared to what came before.
Right. And to understand the greatest of these heroes, we have to start with his origin, specifically his father, a man named Zal. Now, Zal is born into a noble family, but the circumstances of his birth are treated like a scandal.
A huge scandal.
The sources highlight that Zal is born with albinism. He is completely white-haired from the moment he takes his first breath.
And the reaction from his father, Sam, who is a great warrior and a king, is pure superstitious terror. Sam doesn't look at his newborn son and see a child. He sees a bad omen. He thinks the child is a demon or a curse that will ruin his reputation.
It's devastating. I mean, we go from kings who literally taught humanity how to wear clothes to a king who is so paranoid about his own social standing and so frightened of the other that he takes his own infant son and abandons him on the freezing peaks of the Alborz Mountains to die.
It represents a massive moral failing of human civilization. The human institutions, the royal court, the warrior code, have completely failed the innocent.
Yeah.
And because humanity has failed, nature has to step in to balance the scales.
And nature steps in with the simar. The sources describe the simar as this ancient, mystical, giant bird that lives at the peak of the mountain. She possesses the wisdom of ages. She hears the cries of this abandoned baby, swoops down, and instead of eating him, takes him to her nest and raises him alongside her own chicks.
The Sinurg is a brilliant narrative device. She is an echo of older pre-Islamic pantheons, representing the untamed but deeply moral force of the natural world.
Okay, I see that.
By raising Zal, the Simurgh is essentially saying that when human civilization becomes too rigid, too prejudiced, and too blinded by its own norms to care for its most vulnerable, the wild must act as the true guardian of morality.
It's such a beautiful rebuke of the king. Eventually, years later, Sam has a prophetic dream, feels incredibly guilty, and goes searching the mountains. He finds Zal, now a striking, powerful young man, raised by this mythical bird.
A reunion?
Yeah. Sam begs for forgiveness, and Zal, showing incredible grace, returns to the human world. He reintegrates, and he ends up falling deeply in love with a foreign princess named Rudaba from the neighboring kingdom of Kabul.
Which is another profound point. The salvation of the Persian heroic line doesn't come from pure isolated bloodlines. It comes from an outcast raised by a mystical beast marrying a foreign princess whose lineage actually ties back to the tyrant Zahhak.
Wait, really? Her family traces back to Zahhak.
Yes. It is a messy, complex, deeply human union.
And from that incredibly complex union comes the absolute titan of the epic Rostam. He is the ultimate weapon, the shield of Persia. But even getting him into the world is an ordeal.
Because Rostam defies normal human boundaries from the very beginning. The sources detail that the infant was so massive in the womb that a natural birth would have killed his mother, Rudaba.
And once again, human medicine hits a wall. They don't know what to do. Zal has to call upon the Simurgh. He burns one of her feathers, which she had given him as a distress signal.
Right, a magical flare.
Exactly. The great bird appears and teaches them a specialized surgical procedure, what the epic describes as an ancient cesarean section, often called a Rostamzad in Persian, to cut the massive baby out safely and stitch the mother back up.
It perfectly encapsulates what Rostam is. He requires mystical, ancient intervention just to exist in the mortal realm. He's a bridge between the magic of the deep past the brutal reality of the human future.
And he looks the part. He doesn't ride into battle wearing standard-issue royal armor. He is draped in the skin of a leopard.
Right, very iconic.
Yeah, and he tames a horse named Raksh, a magnificent, incredibly violent steed that literally no one else can even approach, let alone ride. Rostam is a force of nature, and his job, essentially, becomes being the ultimate cosmic fixer for the Persian Empire.
And he needs to be, because the kings of the heroic age are largely incompetent.
It's almost comical. The sources constantly show these Persian kings, particularly Qaboos, making incredibly arrogant, foolish decisions.
Constantly.
They invade places they shouldn't. They get tricked by demons disguised as beautiful musicians. They get their entire armies captured and thrown into dungeons in the rival nation of Tyrant.
And every time the crown fails, Rostam has to leave his home, saddle up Rosh, and go clean up the mess. This culminates in the famous Haftkhan, the 7 labors of Rostam, where he has to fight through lions, dragons, witches, and demonic warlords just to rescue his foolish king.
But let's pause and look at the logistics of this dynamic. You have Rostam, who is physically unstoppable, tactically brilliant, and universally beloved. And you have the king, who is constantly steering the empire into a ditch.
A very deep ditch.
Right. So why doesn't Rostam just take the leopard skin off, put the crown on his own head, and run the place efficiently? Why subject himself to this endless, exhausting cycle of rescuing idiots?
Because Rostam is fundamentally trapped by his own sense of duty. He represents the paradox of the ultimate patriot. He doesn't serve the individual man wearing the crown. He serves the idea of the Persian crown. He believes that the institution, the unbroken line of Iran, is more important than his own ego.
So his loyalty is structural, not personal.
Precisely. But the epic uses this to interrogate the burden of power. It forces the listener to ask, where does true authority actually lie? Does it lie with the divine right of an incompetent king, or does it lie in the blood and sweat of the warrior who constantly sacrifices himself to maintain the illusion of the king's power?
That's a great question.
Rostam is the parent forever bailing out a reckless child, but that child holds the destiny of the nation.
He carries the entire civilization on his back. But here's the cruelest part of the epic. The man who can defeat armies and outsmart demons is utterly defenseless against the tragedy of his own past. And this brings us to the emotional core of the Shahnameh, the story of Rostam and Sohrab.
It is a devastating narrative pivot. We go from these grand geopolitical battles against demons to a deeply intimate psychological horror.
It all starts years earlier. Rostam is out on a hunting trip near the borders of the rival kingdom of Tyrant. He ends up having a brief, passionate romance with the local princess named Tamina, but duty calls.
Always does.
He has to return to Persia. Before he leaves, he gives Tamina an armband containing his royal seal. He tells her, if you have a child, give them this, and he rides away, completely unaware that he has left her pregnant.
And that child grows up to be Sohrab. Now, Sohrab is his father's son. He grows incredibly fast, possesses supernatural strength, and becomes a top-tier military commander in Tehran while still basically a teenager.
A teenage general.
Yeah, and he knows his lineage. His mother tells him who his father is.
And Sohrab's reaction to this is so heartbreakingly naive. He doesn't want to destroy Persia. He concocts this massive adolescent dream. He's going to raise a massive army, invade Persia, find the legendary Rostam, overthrow the foolish Persian king Kaykovis, and put his own dad on the throne.
Right.
And then together, father and son will conquer the world. It's an invasion born entirely out of a boy wanting to make his dad proud.
It is aggressive, misplaced filial love. But the political reality on the ground doesn't care about a boy's internal motivations. The Persian king just sees a massive Turanian army crashing over his borders, led by a terrifyingly powerful young general who is crushing everyone in his path.
So predictably, the king panics.
Exactly. And he sends his ultimate weapon. He sends Rostam to the border.
And here we have the setup for the greatest tragedy in the text. Father and son meet on the battlefield. Neither knows what the other looks like. They are wearing full armor. But the sources point out this incredible, agonizing detail. When they face off, Sohrab instinctively feels something.
He senses it.
Yeah, he looks at this massive, weathered warrior in the leopard skin, and his intuition just screams at him. He actually approaches Rostam and says essentially, "Are you him? Are you Rostam? Let's put down our weapons. Let's talk." He offers peace.
And this is where Rostam's lifelong conditioning becomes his fatal flaw. Rostam has spent centuries dealing with the tricks of demons and the deceptions of Turanian warlords. He's the defender of the state. He cannot afford to show weakness.
But it's his son.
He doesn't know that.
Yeah.
When this young enemy general starts asking personal questions and offering peace, Rostam's defense mechanisms flare up. He suspects a psychological trick. He flatly denies his identity and refuses the peace offering.
I have to say, it makes me furious at Rostam. Sohrab gives him the out, but Rostam is so calcified in his role as the rigid, unfeeling shield of Persia that he completely overrides his own humanity. He prioritizes state protocol and his own macho warrior ego over the possibility of connection.
It is the ultimate critique of unquestioning patriotism. Rostam's adherence to his duty blinds him. They fight for 3 grueling, brutal days. It is a stalemate until finally, Rostam relies on his experience, finds an opening, and drives a dagger deep into Sohrab's side, delivering a fatal blow.
And the irony of what happens next is just suffocating. As Sohrab is bleeding out on the dirt, he looks up at the old man who just killed him and says, "You may have defeated me, but you won't escape. When my father finds out what you did, he will hunt you down. My father is Rostam."
The psychological shock of that moment is unparalleled.
Imagine hearing your own name invoked as a threat by the boy you just gutted. Rostam tears open the boy's armor, and there it is, the armband he gave Tamina decades ago, bound to the arm of his dying son. The sources say Rostam lets out a wail that is so agonizing it seems to shatter the world itself.
Visceral.
He throws dirt on his head. He begs for a magical cure, but it's too late.
It is the death of the heroic ideal. This isn't just a sad story about a father and son. It is Ferdowsi asking a terrifying question about the demands of the state. Rostam protected the borders of Persia, but the cost of that absolute loyalty was the murder of his own future.
Wow.
If protecting the empire requires you to plunge a dagger into the heart of your own flesh and blood, has the empire become a monster?
It's a chilling parallel. He spent his life fighting the brain-eating snakes of Zahhak, only to become the instrument that violently consumes the life of his own youth in the name of the state. It breaks him. And honestly, it breaks the epic. After the tragedy of Sohrab, the entire texture of the Shahnameh shifts. The magic starts to drain away.
Exactly. The heroic age begins to close. Rostam himself eventually dies, not in some glorious cosmic battle against a dragon, but by falling into a pit of poisoned spears set up by his own jealous half-brother.
It's so mundane and cruel.
It is an ugly, treacherous, completely human death. And with the invincible shield gone, the veil of myth lifts completely. Persia is thrust into the uncompromising, brutal light of the historical age.
And the reality of history is that empires get conquered. Which brings us to a massive historical force hitting Persia Iskender, Alexander the Great. Now, if you know your history, you know Alexander steamrolls the Persian Empire. He defeats Darius III. He burns the magnificent capital of Persepolis. It is a total cataclysm.
A complete turning point in history.
But the Shahnameh does something absolutely wild with Alexander in its text.
It executes one of the most audacious literary pivots in history. The epic acknowledges that Alexander conquered the empire, but it completely rewrites who Alexander was.
The sources reveal that Ferdowsi depicts Alexander not as a Macedonian Greek invader, but as the secret half-brother of the Persian king he defeats.
Yes. In the narrative of the Shahnameh, a previous Persian king marries a daughter of Philip of Macedon, but sends her back because she has bad breath.
Bad breath, you're kidding.
No, seriously. Yeah. And unbeknownst to the king, she is pregnant with Iskander. So when Alexander comes to conquer Persia, he is actually of royal Persian blood.
Wait, I have to wrap my head around this. They literally just retrofitted Alexander the Great into the Persian family tree.
They did.
That is honestly like getting your house completely demolished by a rogue bulldozer and then sending out a Christmas newsletter saying, oh yeah, the bulldozer driver is actually our cousin from out of town, so technically this was just an aggressive in-family home renovation.
That's an amazing analogy.
It is pure delusion. Why rewrite such a massive, undeniable historical trauma?
Because you have to look at the psychology of a conquered civilization. How do you maintain your cultural dignity when the military reality of your total defeat is undeniable? You didn't say you won the war. So you reframe the nature of the conqueror.
He didn't beat us. He's one of us.
Precisely. By making Alexander a Persian half-brother, the epic suggests that the magnificent Persian Empire wasn't truly bested by an inferior outsider. It was simply an internal family dispute over the throne.
That is so clever.
It is a brilliant, desperate coping mechanism. It allows the culture to absorb the massive trauma of conquest without admitting cultural inferiority. It's a way to swallow the bitter pill of historical defeat by coating it in the honey of myth.
It is historical spin doctoring at its absolute finest. But while you can play psychological games with the past, you cannot stop the march of the future. The epic eventually has to catch up to the reality that Ferdowsi himself was living in. The myth is entirely gone, and we are left strictly with history.
Yes, the final chapters of the Shahnameh deal with the Sasanian Empire, and Ferdowsi gives us a brilliant flash of light before the end. The sources focus on the reign of Khosrow Anushirvan. Under his rule, there's a massive renaissance.
A cultural boom.
Huge. The empire blooms with art, complex administration, and philosophical translations. It is the absolute zenith of historical Persian culture.
It's the empire showing off exactly what it is capable of building. But it's the last gasp. Because we move into the 7th century AD, and the harsh reality of the Arab Islamic conquests comes crashing into the narrative.
And this is where the absence of the mythic elements hurts the most. When the Arab armies amass on the borders, there is no Samurd to fly down and offer a magical solution.
No magic bird.
There is no Rostam in a leopard skin to ride out and single-handedly destroy the enemy vanguard. There is only the exhausted, fracturing reality of the Sasanian military facing an incredibly motivated, newly unified force.
The sources pinpoint the catastrophic climax, the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. The Sasanian forces are completely annihilated. The empire is broken. The final Persian king, Yazdegerd III, is forced to flee from city to city, practically a beggar in his own lands, until he is ultimately murdered in a mill by one of his own subjects for his jewelry.
It is an incredibly undignified, brutal end.
And Ferdowsi doesn't shy away from that brutality. He doesn't invent a magical savior to rewrite the fall of the empire. He lets it end in the dust.
The epic concludes with a letter from a Persian general named Rostam Farakhzad. And it's a tragic irony, sharing the name of the great mythic hero, but possessing none of his invincibility.
Right.
He writes this heartbreaking letter to his brother mourning the impending fall of his homeland. He writes, "Now our crown has vanished and the era of foreigners has arrived."
It is a devastatingly grounded, incredibly sober conclusion to an epic that started with kings who lived for 300 years.
It really is a hard stop.
I have to say, reflecting on the emotional weight of this arc, it is heavy. You spend hours, thousands of verses immersed in a world of terrifying snake monsters, magical giant birds, invincible heroes, golden ages, and then it just bleeds out in the dirt at Al-Qadisiyah. The magic just evaporates. It leaves you feeling hollow.
It is supposed to. Ferdowsi is a master of tone. He documents the ultimate futility of worldly power. Every golden age ends, every hero dies, every physical empire eventually falls to the dust. The tragic, inescapable destiny of the physical world is decay. But if we pull back and look at the meta-context, the reason Ferdowsi spent 30 years writing this in the first place, we see the true victory.
The victory isn't in the plot of the poem, it's the fact that the poem exists at all.
Exactly. The Sasanian Empire died at Al-Qadisiyah. The palaces were looted. But the words survived the invasion when the walls didn't.
Wow.
Ferdowsi essentially took the rubble of his civilization, synthesized its entire worldview, its views on justice, the far, the tragedy of duty, the necessity of the working class, and rebuilt it in meter and rhyme.
Let's synthesize the sheer scope of what we've unpacked here during this deep dive. We started at the dawn of time with Jamshid's Golden Age, where humanity conquered death itself, only to lose paradise to the arrogance of a king.
Right.
We descended into the claustrophobic, thousand-year nightmare of Zahhak and his demonic snakes, where the future was violently consumed every single day. We saw Kaveh, the blacksmith, raise a dirty leather apron to prove that true power resides in the people.
We transitioned into the agonizing complexities of the heroic age. We saw the human feeling of a father discarding his albino son, corrected by the wisdom of the mystical Simark.
Yeah.
We explored the crushing burden of Rostam, the invincible shield, who was forced by duty to repeatedly save foolish kings, culminating in the ultimate heartbreak, the murder of his own son, Sohrab, on the altar of state loyalty.
And finally, we watched the magic drain away. We saw a culture desperately try to rewrite its own trauma by turning Alexander the Great into a cousin, before finally facing the brutal, undeniable twilight of history at Al-Qadisiyah.
And that arc brings us right back to the value of this text for you, the listener. The actual physical Persian Empire, with its crowns and its borders, fell to dust. But as our sources beautifully summarize, Ferdowsi built an eternal empire within the hearts of the Persian people.
He built a home they could carry with them.
He created an arc. And because he wrote it in pure Persian, in a meter that demanded to be spoken aloud, he ensured that the language itself survived the conquest. The Shahnameh is a beautiful, desperate, and ultimately successful record of a people refusing to be erased.
It is the ultimate testament to the durability of a story. He packed an entire civilization into 50,000 couplets and sailed it right through the fires of history.
He really did.
Which leaves me with one final thing I want you to mull over. We live in an era where we think we are permanent. We have digital empires, petabytes of history, endless modern archives stored in the cloud. We feel secure.
We do.
But if our physical world, our grids, our servers were to vanish tomorrow, what is the story we have memorized? What is the leather apron on a spear that we could carry in our minds to prove to the future who we really were?